All right, so here we go. How do we know Jesus really came back to life? Now that we got all the stuff settled, that we know Jesus said he was the Son of God, that he either had to be telling the truth, he was a liar, or he was crazy. You have to make a decision on that one. You can't just be like, nah, I'm not going to make you're making a decision. And by not making a decision, it means that you don't think Jesus was telling the truth, right? Because if you did, it changes everything. So why do we think Jesus came back to life? In all of the gospel accounts, it tells of people saying they saw Jesus come back to life. The people who followed Jesus, his 12 disciples. It tells a story about Mary, a lady who was part of the group of people that followed Jesus around. And they said she was actually the first one to see Jesus, which is a really big thing. Because back in the day, if you wanted to say that your story was credible, you wouldn't lead it off by saying a woman was the first person to see Jesus alive. You wouldn't. You know why? Because back in ancient time when Jesus was alive, you could not be a woman and be interviewed in a court of law. Like you couldn't, your testimony wouldn't hold up for anything. Like even if you saw something happen and you were right there, you couldn't go into a court of law and say, yes, this is exactly what happened and I saw it and that guy did this. Like no one believed you because you were a woman, which is terrible. But that's the way it was, right? So the fact that the disciples, when they chose to write down their accounts of Jesus' life, and especially the fact that Jesus came back to life, like the biggest reason that they have for following him, they wouldn't have used someone that the whole society of the time thought was unreliable, right? They put it in there because it was true, right? They put it in there because Mary really was the first person to see Jesus alive. So that's our first part. Again, check out the Bible if you want to see instances of Jesus coming back to life. Jesus appeared to people. We call them resurrection appearances because he showed himself to people, right? And he showed that he wasn't a ghost. There's one time he eats with the disciples and he eats like fish and bread with them and he lets them poke the holes in his body because he has scars because it's real body. They're not just like imagining things. They don't just see like an apparition. They're not all just like having this weird big daydream together. They see Jesus eat these things and he proves that he is actually a physical alive person by eating stuff with them, right? He does it on a few occasions. But there are 12 instances in the New Testament where people have seen Jesus. So I'm going to post it on the information below on YouTube and in the comments thing on Facebook. So check those out. Go ahead and read them yourself. All right, they're real. These are people saw Jesus come back to life, and this is their accounts of it. We're going to read one of them because one of them is pretty important. It's in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 18 through and 19. Remember, Paul, we're going to talk about Paul in a bit, but Paul wrote this, and he says, I passed on to you right from the first what had been told to me, that Christ died for our sins, just as the Scriptures said he would, and that he was buried. So he's saying Jesus was killed and he was buried. And that 3 days afterwards he arose from the grave, just as the prophets foretold. He's like, it says that was going to happen in the Old Testament, and Jesus did come back to life. He said, he was seen by Peter and later by the rest of the 12, the rest of the disciples. After that, he was seen by more than 500 Christian brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have died by now. Right? Get that. Paul is saying that Jesus was seen by over 500 guys at one time. And again, remember we talked about how they didn't think much of women. When they were counting big groups of people, they didn't count women and children in their estimations of how many people were there, right? So that's 500 men. That means there are maybe at least that many more women, if not more than that. So at least 500 people saw Jesus alive at one time, and maybe it was more than that. It could have been more like 1,000 people saw Jesus alive again at one time, right? Like, and Paul has enough guts to say, if you don't believe me, you know, like, he's like, most of whom are still alive, but some are dead by now, right? Like, he's like, you can go talk to those people. That's what he's saying there. He's like, if you don't believe me, most of them are still alive, so go ask them. Go ahead, like, see if you think I'm crazy. These people saw it too. A bunch of them all at once, right? There wasn't like a giant group hallucination. 500 people said they saw Jesus alive. And then he said, then James saw him, and later all of the apostles. And when we say James, we're talking about Jesus' brother, and we'll get there in a second too. And then Paul says, last of all, I saw him too. So we have accounts from people who say they've seen Jesus alive. What do we do with them? Do we discount all them and just say, oh, they're crazy? Like, we weren't there. How do we know, right? Like, we have to maybe think that there's something going on there. And to me, the fact of the sheer number of it, the fact that Paul had enough guts to say there are people alive, you can go check it out, makes me think that it was really real, right? So what other evidence do we have? The biggest evidence is the empty tomb, right? We know that there was an empty tomb. We know the tomb that Jesus got his body put into by a guy named Joseph of Arimathea. He was this rich guy. He was on the Jewish high council, so all the Jewish people knew him. And he said, put Jesus in my tomb. I believe in Jesus. Let's do this. And the Jewish people even said that Jesus' body wasn't in the tomb, right? Like, the disciples didn't go really far away to preach the gospel, right? They didn't just immediately after Jesus got killed just run away to tell everyone about Jesus. No, they went back to like doing what they were doing before. They went back to their old jobs. They went back to being fishermen. They didn't think anything was going to happen. Like, Jesus is dead. It's over, right? And then Mary saw Jesus, and then Jesus appeared to them. Something changed, right? But they didn't go far away to tell people about Jesus. They stayed in Jerusalem and started telling people about Jesus, and a bunch of people believed. There's no way that they could have made that lie happen if Jesus was still lying in a grave. If there was still a body where everyone knew it was put, people would just go see it and be like, oh no, you're lying. Jesus is dead, right? Like, it wouldn't have kept happening. The church wouldn't have grown. No one would have believed that Jesus came back to life because they would have just seen his body, right? So you're like, well, what if the body was stolen? Well, again, I don't think anyone would have followed that because people would have figured out maybe that the body was stolen, right? And remember, the disciples were not a brave group of people. As soon as Jesus got arrested, most of them ran away and hid. And even after that, some of them remained locked behind a door for like a week because they didn't know what to do and they didn't want to get killed themselves. You know, some of them went back to their old ways and started fishing again because they didn't know what else to do, and they left Jerusalem. But some of them stayed in Jerusalem and were terrified because they thought they were going to get killed, right? These guys did not have the courage to go sneak off and steal a body. It wasn't happening, right? So the Jewish high priest made that story up. They paid off temple guards. It actually says it in the account of Luke, that they paid off temple guards to tell everyone that Jesus' disciples stole the body because they didn't want it to be true, because if that was the case, then they really killed the Son of God, right? And the Jewish leaders did not want that to be the case. We talk about the witnesses. There are other witnesses around that are just not in the Bible. If you don't believe the Bible at all, which you should believe some, like some of it's just written as an account of what happened, a factual thing, not trying to like put forth a religion necessarily as just telling what happened. That's mostly what the Gospels are, and that's definitely what Luke and the other book he wrote, Acts, is all about. But there was a guy named Josephus, and he was a historian of the time, and people thought he was very reliable. And this is what he said. He said, at that time, there was a wise man named Jesus. His conduct was good, and he was known to be virtuous. Many people from among the Jews and other nations became his disciples. He says, there are a lot of people following this Jesus guy. Pilate condemned him to be crucified and to die. But those who became his disciples did not abandon his discipleship, right? So he's saying this Roman governor that is really real, and I'm a real historian writing this down, condemned him to die, which means he died. They didn't mess that up, right? He says, but those who were his disciples didn't stop being his disciples. He's like, these people kept following this guy who was killed, right? He says they were reported that they appeared to see him alive 3 days after his crucifixion. So here, a guy who is a historian, who doesn't follow Jesus, doesn't believe in it at all, looks at the situation. He says they reported to see him 3 days after the crucifixion. Just the same thing that we hear in the Bible, right? He says, and they said that he was alive, accordingly that perhaps he was the Messiah, concerning who the prophets had talked about, right? He's here, this guy who doesn't follow Jesus, who's a historian, who writes about, wars and emperors and all kind of things like that, looks at just really quickly at the life of Jesus, and he thinks it's big enough to mention and all of that stuff, right? There are a bunch of other people going around doing stuff, and he decides to mention Jesus in his writings. That's an amazing thing. He says Jesus was appeared to his people 3 days after his crucifixion, and they thought that he really was alive. And then he said, accordingly, he was perhaps the Messiah. So even Josephus is saying, this historian who didn't believe in Jesus, wasn't a Jew, had no dog in this fight at all, said, you know what, if that really happened, then maybe he was really the Messiah, like the Jewish people are talking about, right? So we have other witnesses from that too. We talk about the apostles' newfound courage is another way we know that Jesus really came back to life. Because remember, they all ran away, they hid, they were scared. And then they ended up preaching in front of giant crowds of people in Jerusalem. Read Acts chapter 3 through 5. It's like Peter just stepping up and telling everyone about Jesus in public. And then they were like, you know what, we're going to take you and beat you and whip you if you don't shut up. And he's like, fine. And he doesn't shut up. And he keeps saying that Jesus came back to life and died for people's sins and that people can know him and get close to God. Like, that's what Peter's saying, right? And he goes and gets beaten and whipped for it. He gets thrown in jail for it. All the disciples do, right? They have this newfound courage, and something had to change that, right? From them being terrified, hiding after Jesus was killed, to being so bold to go out and risk their lives for telling people that Jesus was who he said he was. We've talked about James and Paul a lot, but remember, James was Jesus' brother, and when Jesus was alive, James didn't believe Jesus was the Son of God. He was like, just thought he was his brother. He thought his brother was crazy, probably, right? But then something changed. He started following Jesus. He wrote the book of James in the New Testament. Read it. Check it out. It's this Jesus' very own brother, someone who saw Jesus every day of his life growing up. And he's like, no, you're not the Son of God. And then he knows that Jesus is dead. His mom was there, saw it happen, right? And James is like, you know what? You're right. Like, you're the Son of God. You know why? Because he had to see him alive again, right? He was one of those people who saw him alive. Remember, Paul in 1 Corinthians says, James saw him and believed now that he's alive, that he really is the Son of God. So that's good enough, right? And we talk about Paul a ton, so we're not going to do that. But a guy who used to kill Christians became a Christian, ended up being killed to tell people that Jesus really was who he said he was. All right, last thing. The biggest reason that I've ever found for believing that Jesus really came back to life is all of the people who followed him, all of his disciples, were killed for saying that Jesus came back to life. And again, if they were scaredy cats and they ran away, they would have easily broken down and lied. You know, if they knew Jesus was lying or they knew he was crazy, they wouldn't have died for him. Not for a second. Those guys didn't have it in them to do that, right? Peter still denied Jesus 3 times, and he ended up still getting killed for Jesus. He denied Jesus when Jesus was on the cross, when he was killed, right? And when he was going to trial. And then later he ends up getting killed for saying that Jesus came back to life, right? So he had to have seen it happen. All of the disciples, some of them got crucified upside down. You feel like if you knew it was a lie, and at the point where they're trying to drive nails into your hands, you would probably be like, you know what, you're right, it's a lie. But they didn't back down because they knew that they had seen Jesus alive, and it changed everything for them. So take a look at all these videos, take a look at all the evidence there, and make a decision, because Jesus either came back to life and he's the Son of God, or he didn't. That's it. You have to make a choice on one of those 2 things. So what is it? And we're going to be talking about in the next few weeks, what does that look like then? If Jesus came back to life, like, what does that mean for us? So love you guys. God bless.